The Mayor, Sadiq Khan, is heading out to Forest Hill, right there on the boundary between the current zones of being charged for ULEZ and not, across the South Circular there, to make the announcement today in a keynote speech that he's considering expanding the zone to cover the whole of Greater London. And that would incorporate an awful lot more people in the ultra-low emission zone. We've been talking about it this morning and what you think about it. I mean, it's only 4 months after Sadiq Khan expanded the ULEZ zone out to the North and South Circulars. And this morning, BBC Radio London understands that he's planning to extend it even further to cover the whole of Greater London. But, he has, in the process, ruled out the new charge for every driver who crosses the border into Greater London. But joining me now is Zack Polanski, a Green Party politician who's been a member of, the London Assembly since May 2021. Morning, Zack.
Morning, Jim. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. I understand you're on your way to this speech this morning in Forest Hill. What's your initial reaction, then, to this proposal?
Well, if it's what you're reporting, then I massively applaud it. But ultimately, applause is not going to clean up our air in London. And actually, this is an interim step to what Greens have been calling for a long time. And that's a smart, privacy-friendly, fair road charging scheme. Now, what does that mean? That means every car would be charged by the type of vehicle it is, the emissions it emits, the time of day, where it's driving. So actually, that's a much more specific scheme. So people are being charged for where they're driving and what they're driving, as opposed to a blanket charge, which is good, but I think we can get better in 2022. Now, I've been pushing the Mayor on this, and he said that he will implement it by 2030. But actually, we can't wait 8 years to have a better policy to clean up our air. We need to bring in fair road charging now.
What are the obstacles, then, in the way of implementing that sooner, do you think?
Well, the Mayor at the moment is the obstacle to the Green Party, because he's saying that, we need to make sure that we get the technology right, that it's privacy friendly, and we agree with all of those things. But actually, Centre for London in 2018 released a report that said we are ready to start smart road charging now. And actually, we think we're there. So what we want the Mayor to do is show real leadership on this. And this interim step is good, but actually we could be a global leader in this by bringing in a road charging scheme that would be fair to everyone. And by the way, on the Assembly yesterday, I spoke to people who are in charge of the recovery for London, and I was talking to them about the fact that pedestrians spend 40% more on our high streets than people who drive cars. So actually, this is good for health, it's good for the environment, and it's good for our economy too.
What about the impact of expanding the zone to the North and South Circular? You're starting to see early numbers from that. What are you seeing from that expansion of the zone to cover that particular part of London?
So this is undoubtedly necessary. A recent Environment Committee, and I'm chair of the Environment Committee, although I'm speaking to you in a personal capacity, we looked at Tower Hamlets, and we had a doctor who came on who said there are children growing up in Tower Hamlets now who are being born who will grow up with stunted lungs. Now, that is shocking that there's people in London in 2022 who are growing up with a different lung than maybe someone in Kensington, for instance. So this is a huge social justice issue as well. And sometimes these things can seem a bit abstract because air is something we can't always see, and we can't see toxic air. But actually, when you look at the figures, the toxic air in London often correlates where you have working class communities or often communities of colour. So I think it's absolutely necessary that the Mayor makes sure that we're really on this.
We've also got small businesses trying to just go about their business serving Londoners. We've got people living in the current charging zones who are telling me they're having to pay a huge premium for deliveries on items that they just couldn't otherwise get to their homes, things like flooring, for example. I mean, you can't just go down to the high street and buy that. You need it delivered. And because this particular caller lived in Pimlico, she's immediately slapped with an £80 surcharge for delivery. If that's expanded to the whole of Greater London, that's going to be a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a really fair challenge. So we're talking about two things there. We're talking about how people get around the city, and then we're talking about deliveries. In terms of how people get around our city, we need to make sure that we have better public transport, that it's cheaper, that it's more accessible, that it runs regularly. Now, that's pretty good in inner London, but some of the outer London boroughs, we know from research that we've done that at least 1 in 4 Londoners feel forced to own a car. So as well as implementing road charging, it is vitally necessary that we also move our infrastructure.
Sure. I mean, I live in Sutton, so I'm used to getting public transport 80% of the time, but I do need my car for a lot of things, and I can't imagine not having it, because I do live in that outer London borough. It's much more challenging to get around than it would if I was living in zone 1 or 2. It's just a fact of life, isn't it?
And the Green Party have been campaigning on that for a long time, that actually outer London needs that investment. Just as we sometimes see across the country, that sometimes it feels like the north has been ignored. I think in London, we also do have division. And actually in the outer boroughs, we need to make sure that we're investing things like safer cycling infrastructure, making sure that the buses are electric, that they're more accessible, and that they come into central London as well as other places in outer borough. You often have that problem that you have direct lines straight to the centre of London, but if you want to get from one outer borough to the other outer borough, you have to come into central London and go back out again. That's not acceptable. So one measure is not going to do this, Jim. What we need is a holistic approach and make sure we've got all the active ingredients to making sure that we've got a fair, privacy-friendly, smart road charging system.
And what about the problems that will inevitably impact on businesses who are quite happy going about their business right now, serving their customers, and suddenly those extra charges are going to make it impossible?
So I think there's a few things to say there. One thing is that Greens for a long time have been pushing for more money for scrappage schemes. We need to make sure that we're protecting businesses and absolutely charities as well, who can be impacted when we're altering infrastructure like this, or the way that we get around our city. And we need those people to have clean air as well, because although they're businesses and although they're charities, they're people too. They have lungs, and ultimately everyone benefits from cleaner air. The World Health Organization, that's WHO, already had quite tight guidelines, and in some boroughs we were already missing them. Last year they tightened those guidelines to show how toxic our air is, and we were way under target in some areas, including lots of places where there's schools. So it's absolutely important again. And just one final thing I would say that the mayor really needs to change is he's planning to build a £2.5 billion new road building project. That's called the Silvertown Tunnel. That's going to stretch from Newham to Greenwich. Newham has some of the worst toxic air in the city. It doesn't make sense that the mayor wants to build more roads. If you want to reduce traffic, you need to reduce roads. So I think all of these things in conjunction can work together.
Well, yeah, there are conflicting views on that, aren't there, in that theory. But you're talking about a bit of investment in public transport. You're talking about scrappage schemes, all of which cost a lot of money. Zach, have you costed this as the Green Party? And if so, where are you getting the money from? We saw another tube strike yesterday because the TfL network is struggling to get through to their union members about their proposed changes to pension schemes. Money is tight. We know that to be true. We saw it play out across London yesterday. Where are you suddenly finding your magic money tree to make all of this investment from?
Really good question. So there's two things there. When you say there's conflict over the Silvertown Tunnel with two sides, I would say I'm on the side of scientists and experts and the communities of Newham and Greenwich.
Sure, but you say reduce roads reduces traffic. That's not always the case, isn't it?
It is actually. So there's something called induced road demand, which shows all around the world when you build more roads, you get more traffic. If you reduce roads, it reduces traffic. Now, the mayor's saying he needs to build the Silvertown Tunnel because he wants to reduce congestion at the Blackwall Tunnel. But actually, he could put a toll on the Blackwall Tunnel, which he's planning to do anyway, without building the Silvertown Tunnel. I think it's nonsensical to anyone listening to this that to do a toll on one tunnel, you need to build another tunnel and toll both. You could just toll the Blackwall Tunnel and make sure, again, we've got better public transport, better cycling lanes, etc. In terms of the money, that's a really good question too, because we can't rely on magic money trees. That's exactly why we want to bring in a smart road charging system. This is the principle that the polluter pays. So the person who is driving with a type of day, the emissions of their vehicle, etc., are paying to better public transport for the rest of the city. We have an unconscionable situation at the moment where to drive your car can often be cheaper than getting on the tube or getting on a bus. We need to completely reverse that and make sure that it's cheaper to use public transport than it is to be in a private vehicle.
How much would it cost to implement a road charging scheme, a pay-per-mile scheme, with all the technology and the camera networks and everything else that would be required to achieve that?
So this is where we need to drum into that detail. And the mayor says he wants to have that conversation. I'm ready to have that conversation. And those numbers are there. But ultimately, the complication there is a lot of those cameras are already ready because they're using the ULEZ scheme. So we've got cameras all over London. I think the key thing here is to make sure privacy is baked in. You'll remember when the congestion charge was brought in under Ken Livingstone, it was promised that that would be privacy protected. And when Boris Johnson, whatever happened to him, became mayor, he then gave that information to the Metropolitan Police. Now, that's unacceptable. We need to make sure at the very beginning that whatever system there is for Londoners, it's transparent and we know exactly what's happening with our data. All of those things aren't insurmountable, though, but we need to start having those conversations now. And again, I welcome the steps today, but we've got to make sure that we're looking at the long term and not just the short term.
The alternative to cameras is you actually put the tracking device in the vehicle, don't you? And you use people's smartphones or an app or something that you have to sign up to and log your journey. That would be much more accurate for one thing. But of course, again, opens up all those privacy questions, Zach, doesn't it? There's a lot to explore here, isn't there?
Now you're onto something, and I'm loving that we're talking about it on the radio. So there's some really interesting ways of doing these things. Having an app on your phone is something I understand that can put people off. So I would say there has to be huge reassurances that although it's tracking you, that it immediately forgets your journey, and also that information can't be shared anywhere else. And again, those things, as a Green Party campaigner who cares a lot about privacy, are fundamental to me. But again, I'm hearing over and over again from places around the world, like Singapore actually, that they're finding ways of doing this where your privacy can be protected. We just need to look at those models.
Zach, it's fascinating. I know you're en route to the speech today. Thank you very much indeed for taking some time out to talk to us this morning. The Mayor's on his way, I understand it, to Forest Hill, where he's going to make this announcement in a short while. We're taking your reaction, though, because we brought this to you first here on BBC Radio London this morning. The Mayor's plans to expand the ultra-low emission zone London-wide, 0800 731 2000. More of your calls to come.